Rain played gleefully through the streets as the night crept on. Puddles splashed amongst themselves as those outside sought shelter with raised coats and ducked heads. Within a rickety, brigand-owned tavern, a proud Ionan man made every drink like it was his finest. A third glass of wine and a fifth tankard of rum were placed like bags of gold before a grey-skinned elf and a golden-haired gnome. The aged, one-armed elf took the rum as he swayed with the melody that filled the room, raising his drink towards the accordion player, passionately attempting to earn his coin. The gap-toothed gnome swayed too, smiling brightly next to her friend despite the hostile surroundings. Frank chuckled to himself at the scene. The two's love of the music inspiring a similar drunken sway from the more inebriated thugs that inhabited the tavern. The innkeeper's joy-filled grin held on his lips for a few moments before he reached above himself to knock his knuckles against a small cowbell that hung above the bar. "Last call!" Frank announced, his boisterous voice sweeping across the tavern like a tidal wave. A resounding groan from the wasted thugs pulled a cheerful laugh from the innkeeper, waving off their dissent dismissively. "You've got all your lives to drink. Go to bed and save some for tomorrow, eh? Let the ale age." He placed his hands on the counter with a challenging raised brow. A few irritated murmurs protested still, but the drunkards would indeed leave tonight. A blessing Frank would hold dear to his heart every time he received it. He turned his gaze to the two music lovers, giving the gnome a knowing nod that she returned. "You and your friend's enthusiasm is infectious, Miss Turncatcher. Even saw Ollie tapping his foot to the music, so I did. About time these miserable bastards enjoyed themselves. Take your time with your last round. Spot's reserved for you." Frank patted the spot in front of him as he leaned back up to his full height, grinning down at them like a giant. "Anytime." The gnome smiled sweetly before swivelling in her stool to face her companion. "Was, good to see you again, Sirac." "Of course it was." He took another mouthful of rum before flashing her a sly smirk. Nessa snickered and lightly punched the elf in the ribs, muttering, "Horse's ass." Picking up her wine and taking a healthy sip, she looked him in his golden eyes, her expression showing that she meant it, his own saying what his words did not. The feeling was mutual. "You never said why you came to Queen's Edge. You don't usually take risks like this." Nessa leaned back against the bar, resting her weight on one elbow. Worry not. They've learned their lesson about trying to hang me here." He leaned onto his elbow to whisper proudly. "Yes, you've told me that one before. Twice. If you're going to start another tale, go for one from this century. Please." She rolled her eyes. "But it's a good one." "Fine, fine." The elf set his drink down, muttering a few curses below his breath as he started to pat himself down. "Well, about what you were asking. Here for you I was," Sirac announced, producing a letter from his large flowing red coat. For me?" "Aye. Been a while, but I'm still checking your old box in the hammer." He handed the letter to her. It was addressed to a shop that didn't exist anymore and to a name she hated. She didn't even need to open it to know who it was from. The only two people she loved enough to keep in blissful ignorance of her mistakes. "Damn it," she muttered, the wine on her tongue turning sour as she turned the parchment over in her lap. Swiveling back around to face the bar and downing her remaining wine like it was a shot, Nessa went to break the seal on the letter with her thumb, but hesitated. Sirac leaned sideways on the bar, putting all of his weight on his elbow and resting his hand on top of Nessa's. "Sleep on it. It's far too late to read anyway. Bad for your eyes, so I hear," Sirac said softly, attempting to meet her gaze with kind eyes. She shook her head slowly, giving a weak but genuine smile. "I should write them again soon." Nessa's eyes fell further, unable to raise past the elf's shirt. "I didn't speak to my parents for almost decades at a time. You're not as bad as I." He sat up, putting a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Decades are nothing to you and yours. At least they knew what you were." She hunched over further, staring back at the letter. "And yet, they still spoke to me. Parents are like that. Good ones, anyway. They love you, no matter what." I know. I don't want to tell them I failed." She lifted a hand up to her forehead, running her fingers through her tangled mess of a bun. "You haven't failed shit, Ness," he said sternly as he finished his rum. She was silent for a few moments, eyes scanning over the elegant handwriting that must have taken her father a few tries to get right. Putting her elbows on the counter, she closed her eyes and rested her head on her palms as creeping thoughts clawed their way out from the back of her head. The truth of the city's cheeriest barmaid bubbled to the surface as her resting smile sank like an anchor. Nessa's lower lip quivered and the gnome's bright aura cracked. A single drop of liquid pain rolled down her cheek and peeled free from her flesh to plummet onto the wood below. "I fucking hate this city," she whimpered bitterly. The elf's shoulders sank as he watched his friend in all of her frustration. He tried to think of the right thing to say, his mind drawing a blank as he observed the weak yet pained breaths of someone holding back a flood with what little wine-dampened strength they could muster. "There's a spot on the Redeemer, if you want it." Sirac watched her as his words passed through his lips. At first, it seemed like she didn't even register what he was saying, simply keeping her eyes forward while her fingers fidgeted with a loose thread on the back of one of her gloves. "I wanna stop having to move all the time, Sirac. Sailing is the opposite of what I need." She finally spoke, voice weak with the burden of having nowhere to call home in years. "A ship is, it's a home you can take with you, Ness. And the crew, it's family. If you hate this place, don't make it your home. Don't force yourself to call that band of cutthroats you work for a family. At least let me take you to Hera. The Fang Queen and I have close ties. They won't be able to find you there, I promise." He continued, ready to plead with his gaze if she lifted her head. "I'll think about it." She patted his leg to show the offer was appreciated. He was right, and she hated that. If she stayed out of stubbornness, she would be spending the rest of her life in a bar that had a gun under every table, surrounded by monsters of men that could turn on her at the drop of a coin. Sirac dipped his head forward a bit as he turned away from the bar. Standing up slowly, he took a moment to steady himself before turning back to her. "People will always appreciate a lighthouse in the storm, Ness." He gave her a soft smirk as he put his hand in his pocket. "It's storming out." He tipped his head to the innkeeper and started to walk off. "I'll be around for a week. I'll take your reply back with me if you get it done by then. And come find me if you need to speak to someone about Lily. I'm sorry things didn't end well between the two of you. Get some sleep, yeah?" he said over his shoulder as he walked out into the street. Nessa looked back to the envelope, wiping her eyes with her dirty gloves. With a deep breath, she broke the seal and opened it up. Peering inside, she saw a small, lumpy burlap pouch and a letter. Recognizing it instantly, Nessa pulled out the pouch and waved down Frank as he passed by, big hands full of dirty tankards. Hey, Frank! You know how to do coffee here?" The Ionan looked down at the glassy-eyed gnome curiously, but nodded all the same. Before he could say a word, the burlap pouch of coffee beans was pushed into his chest. Raising a brow, he simply smiled and complied. The chance to make UAF coffee superseding his declaration of last call. Nessa sat back into her stool as a fiery blush warmed her cheeks. Turning her attention back to the letter, she unfolded the paper and started to read, immediately cringing at seeing Nessie written in fancy calligraphy at its top. She scanned through each heartfelt word from the two old gnomes in Anne's pool, a soft smile crawling up her face as her parents filled her in on inconsequential details that meant the world to her. A neighbour's new cat, her cousin commissioning a fancy guild in Kester for a masterwork, her mother taking on a new apprentice in her workshop, her father's latest alchemical formula. It all made everything feel so normal. A warm but painful pit grew in her stomach as she kept reading. The questions. About her shop, about her new home, about how the Danikins treat alchemy, about how she's doing. All questions she knew she'd have to lie to answer, the very prospect of which made her choke up. "Here you go!" Frank set a steaming clay mug in front of the gnome. Nessa blinked at him before looking at the coffee. "Oh! I'm impressed. Smells just right. You're a star." She beamed up at him as she took hold of the carved mug with both hands. "Tried me very best for you, Ness. Don't let that keep you up too long now. We all need rest. He bowed his head to her with a kind smile. Nessa returned the nod and took a tentative sip from the coffee, closing her eyes as it tasted exactly as she remembered. The nostalgia hit her like a truck, and caused the budding tears in her eyes to start to stream down her cheeks as she was brought all the way back to her teens, far south and living in the cold shadow of the 10 locked gates. It's perfect, Frank. She cleared her throat and attempted to blink the tears away. Tastes like home, eh? It's what I always loved about the Free Isles Red you had there. Never had a house or tavern in me life that felt like me home, but no matter where I was, when I had a glass of the Isles in me hand, I was exactly where I belonged. Frank got a distant look in his eye as he smiled to himself. Looking back to Nessa, he patted her on the head as he turned to walk away, going back to his closing time cleanup. His words resonated with her more than she thought possible. Nessa faced the letter again, taking a sip of home as she neared its end. We hope you enjoy the little gift. Be sure not to drink it too late, though. You promised me no more all-nighters. Your mother insists this is exactly the kind you loved before your journey to Danica. She knows you always worked your best when you had a cup in your hand. But, of course, you're our daughter. All of your work is your best. Even your worst. Always remember that, Nessie. No matter what, we'll be proud of you. We love you, Nessa. I'm trying, Father, she whispered softly. Nessa lowered the coffee, letting the half-empty mug warm her cold hands as tears dried on her cheeks. The rain outside the shoddy door pounded against the cobblestone streets. The few drunks remaining murmured incoherently to each other, the floorboards creaking under every giant Ionan step. So small and surrounded by such strange people. Nessa chewed on her bottom lip as she stared into the black void that was her parents' coffee. Maybe I do know what home feels like. She muttered to herself as her mind drifted away. A soft smile here, a laugh there. A compliment traded, one given for free. A drink bought with pride and drank with reverence. A couple of Therians and their staff, sharing a few genuine smiles after a job well done. A balcony where she could see forever. The smell of a perfume shop. The taste of red wine and the bright smirk of a redhead that warmed her broken heart. Yeah. Maybe I do. Nessa smiled.